In the autumn of 1893, on a windswept slope on the western flank of Pike's Peak, a crew of miners broke through into a pocket of rock that should not have been there. What they found in the dark below Cripple Creek, Colorado, would be argued over in bunkhouses and saloons for the next 100 years, and the passage they found it in would be filled, capped, and sealed with a violence that no ordinary abandoned shaft ever received. This is the story as it has been passed down, reconstructed from company. Ledgers, half-burned newspaper clippings, and the memories of old-timers who swore they knew a man who was there. Some of it can be verified, some of it cannot. All of it has survived for a reason. Cripple Creek in 1893 was not yet the town history remembers. 2 years earlier, it had been empty grazing land, high mountain valley used for cattle and little else, until a rancher named Bob Womack found gold-bearing quartz on Poverty Gulch and set off one of the last great gold rushes in American history. By the time the Panic of 1893 rolled through the country and gutted the silver mines across the state, Cripple Creek was already swelling with men who had nowhere else to go. Silver miners abandoned their claims in Leadville, Aspen, and Creede, and they poured over the passes into the district, around Pike's Peak, because gold, unlike silver, was still worth something. Within 3 years, there would be more than 150 mines cut into these hills. In the fall of 1893, that boom was just beginning to accelerate. And it was accelerating fast enough that safety, oversight, and record-keeping were often the first things sacrificed for speed. It was in that chaos, on a claim whose exact name has been lost or deliberately scrubbed from most surviving records, that a drift crew working the deeper level of a modest gold operation put a charge into a wall of rock that had been giving them trouble for days. The drift, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is simply a horizontal tunnel driven into a hillside, or connecting shafts underground, as opposed to a vertical shaft. Drifts were the workhorses of hard rock mining. Miners lived inside them for 10 and 12-hour shifts, hauling ore, timbering the walls, breathing air that grew thinner and staler the farther they pushed. This particular drift had been advancing steadily westward for weeks, following a vein that the foreman believed would open into a rich pocket of ore. Instead, according to the story that has survived, the crew broke into something else entirely, a natural void, a cavity in the rock that had no business existing at that depth, filled with air that the men described afterward as unnaturally cold and strangely still, as if it had not moved in a very long time. What they found inside that cavity is where the story starts to fracture into different versions, depending on who is telling it. The most consistent thread across every telling is that the miners did not find ore. They found objects. Some accounts describe worked stone, shaped by hands rather than by weather or water, arranged in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. Other versions speak of metal, tarnished and strange, unlike any assay the district had produced before, objects that did not match the geology of the surrounding rock at all, as though they had been placed there rather than formed there. A few of the more elaborate tellings, the kind that circulated in mining camps as much for entertainment as for information, describe something closer to remains, bones that were too large, too oddly proportioned, or arranged in configurations that unsettled even hardened men who had spent years underground and considered themselves unshockable. Whatever it was, the effect on the crew was immediate and consistent across every account. Work stopped. Men who had been laughing and joking an hour before went quiet. Some refused to go back into the drift at all, forfeiting wages they desperately needed in a district where every dollar mattered. The foreman, whose name shows up in a handful of second-hand references but was never confirmed in any surviving payroll ledger, is said to have sent a runner up to the surface immediately, not to the mine owner first, but to the superintendent. And from the superintendent, the word apparently traveled fast, because within 2 days, a small group of men who were not miners, who did not dress like miners and did not speak like them either, arrived at the site and took over the operation entirely. This is the part of the story where the historical record, thin as it already is, essentially disappears. No newspaper of the period, at least none that has survived in searchable archives, ran a headline about a discovery at any Cripple Creek claim in the fall of 1893. That absence is itself part of what has kept the legend alive for well over a century. In a district that was aggressively covered by no fewer than 4 competing newspapers within a year, a district whose every strike, cave-in, dispute, and discovery of ore was breathlessly reported because investors back east were hungry for any scrap of information that might move a stock price. The idea that something this dramatic could happen and generate absolutely no contemporary coverage is either evidence that the story is pure invention, or evidence that someone worked very hard, very quickly, to make sure it never got printed. The old-timers who kept this story alive into the 20th century tended to favor the second explanation, and they had reasons beyond simple superstition. Cripple Creek in the 1890s was not just a mining district. It was a place where enormous amounts of capital were flowing in from Colorado Springs, from Denver, and from investors in the East, and even in England, all of them betting on claims sight unseen based on assay reports and rumor. A discovery that threw doubt on the ordinary, explainable geology of a claim, something that suggested forces or intelligences the assay office had no box to check for. Would have been a disaster for men whose entire fortune depended on convincing skittish investors that Cripple Creek gold was a safe, rational, thoroughly modern business proposition. It is not hard to imagine why such men, faced with something inexplicable in their own tunnel, would choose secrecy over sensation, and why they would have both the money and the motive to buy that secrecy from every miner who had seen what they saw. According to the story, that is precisely what happened. The men who arrived from outside paid the crew, all of them, a sum reportedly well beyond a normal season's wages, on the condition that they leave the district entirely and never speak of what they had found. Several accounts claim that most of the crew did exactly that, scattering to other camps in Colorado, Idaho, and Montana, and a few are said to have left mining altogether. One persistent detail, repeated in more than one telling with enough consistency to be interesting even if it cannot be verified, is that at least one member of that crew broke his silence decades later as an old man telling the story to a grandchild or a boarder or a bartender, insisting it was the truth, even as everyone around him assumed it was simply the rambling of an old miner who had spent too many years underground. The drift itself, according to every version of the story, was destroyed rather than simply abandoned. Abandoned mine workings were common throughout the district. Claims failed constantly in this period. Ore played out, veins pinched off, water flooded, lower levels faster than pumps could handle, and companies folded as quickly as they formed. An abandoned drift was simply left, its entrance sometimes marked with a warning sign, sometimes not marked at all, the timber inside left to rot and eventually collapse on its own. What happened to this particular drift was different. The entrance was packed with timber, then with waste rock, and finally, according to the most persistent and strangest detail in the whole story, the outer collar of the tunnel, the metal reinforcement ring used to keep the portal from collapsing, was sealed shut with a torch, welded closed in a way that no other mine closure in the district's recorded history is described as having been done. This is worth pausing on because it is the detail that gives the legend its staying power, and it is also the detail that is hardest to make sense of using the technology available in 1893. Oxyacetylene welding, the kind of torch work most people picture when they hear the word welded, was not yet commercially practical in the United States at that time. Acetylene generators and the necessary equipment did not become widely available for industrial use until roughly the turn of the century, and did not see wide practical application until the early 1900s. Blacksmiths could forge weld iron by heating it and hammering it together, and that technique was certainly available to any mining operation with a smith on payroll, since forge welding of iron fittings, rail joints, and tool repair was standard practice in every mining district in the American West. So the sealing of that portal, if it happened as described, would have been accomplished the hard way, with coal-fired forges, hand tools, and iron fittings hammered and fused into a barrier meant to be permanent rather than simply blocked with timber and rock, which was the normal, cheap, and fast method of closing an unwanted opening. The extra labor and expense implied by that detail is exactly the kind of thing that makes people wonder what could possibly have been worth the trouble in a district where every dollar of investment capital was being poured into digging holes open, not closing them. Layered on top of the physical description of the sealing is the human cost the story attaches to it. And this is where the legend edges from strange into genuinely dark. More than one telling claims that not everyone who saw what was inside that drift made it out to talk about it, that the men who came from outside to handle the situation were not interested merely in silence bought with money, and that at least some of the original crew simply vanished from the district's employment rolls and were never accounted for again. Given how transient mining camp labor was in this era, with men drifting from claim to claim and district to district following rumors of pay and opportunity, a handful of miners disappearing from the record would not, on its own, be remarkable. Men left Cripple Creek constantly, for Leadville, for the Klondike a few years later, for wherever the next strike seemed to promise better wages. It is the combination of that ordinary transience with the specific, repeated claim that these particular men vanished immediately after this particular event that gives the story its edge, even though it is precisely the kind of claim that is nearly impossible to verify and equally impossible to disprove more than a century after the fact. The timing of all this deserves its own attention because 1893 was not a quiet year in Cripple Creek by any measure, discovery or no discovery. This was the same year the district's labor situation was becoming explosive, as mine owners, feeling the economic pressure of the National Depression and the collapse of silver prices statewide, began looking for ways to cut costs. And one of the easiest costs to cut was labor, specifically by lengthening the workday without raising pay. That August, miners at the Isabella mine struck rather than accept a longer shift for the same wage, and their strike spread quickly through the district. eventually forcing concessions from the mine owners and setting the stage for the far larger and more violent confrontation that would erupt the following year in 1894, when armed strikers occupied Bull Hill and the governor himself was drawn into a standoff between a private army hired by the mine owners and the miners' union. In other words, 1893 was a year when Cripple Creek's mine owners were already nervous, already dealing with labor unrest, already worried about anything that might spook investors or give organized miners more leverage. A story about workers discovering something inexplicable underground, something that could not be assayed, priced, or explained by any geologist on staff, would have been exactly the kind of uncontrollable variable that a nervous mine owner in that specific year would have paid handsomely to bury, in every sense of the word. There is also the matter of the fire. In April of 1896, 2 catastrophic fires swept through the town of Cripple Creek itself, destroying much of the downtown business district and leaving roughly half the town's residents homeless in the span of a few days. Fires of this kind were common in boomtowns built quickly out of green lumber, and Cripple Creek's fires are well documented as accidents of the sort every mining boomtown eventually suffered. But in the tellings of this particular legend, the 1896 fire takes on a second, darker function, because more than one version of the story claims that whatever paperwork, assay records, or company correspondence might have existed, documenting the original discovery in 1893, was housed in offices that burned in that fire, conveniently erasing any physical trace of what might have been written down at the time. Whether that detail was invented after the fact to explain the record's silence, or whether it reflects something that people genuinely believed happened, is impossible to say. What can be said is that the fire is real. The destruction it caused to the town's business district is real, and the loss of records in mining boomtown fires of this era was an extremely common and mundane occurrence, which means the detail fits neatly into the story whether or not it was ever true. By the early 20th century, as Cripple Creek's mining operations matured and the district's population swelled past its peak, the story of the sealed drift had become one of those pieces of local folklore that every old hand seemed to know a version of, usually secondhand, usually attached to a slightly different claim name, a slightly different year. A slightly different description of what exactly had been found. That instability is common to oral folklore everywhere. A story told and retold across decades naturally drifts, no pun intended, picking up embellishments and losing precise details as it passes from one teller to the next. Some versions insist the sealed portal can still be located today, somewhere on the hillsides between Cripple Creek and Victor, marked only by an unusually deliberate pile of waste rock and a rusted, fused iron collar barely visible beneath a century of erosion and vegetation. Other versions claim the site was destroyed entirely during later, larger mining operations that reworked much of the district's surface in the 20th century, when the modern open-pit operations that still produce gold in the area today reshaped hillsides that once held dozens of smaller 19th century claims. If the site ever existed as described, it is entirely plausible that later industrial mining simply erased it without anyone involved having any idea of its supposed history. What makes a story like this durable is not usually the strength of its evidence, which in this case is thin to the point of nearly disappearing under any serious scrutiny, but the way it fits into a much older and much broader pattern of stories that mining communities all over the world have told about the earth punishing or rewarding those who dig too deep, or those who disturb something that was better left undisturbed. Miners in this era were, almost without exception, deeply superstitious people, and for good reason. Their work was genuinely dangerous, genuinely unpredictable, and genuinely mysterious in the sense that even experienced men could not always tell from the surface what conditions awaited them 1,000 feet underground. Cave-ins, gas pockets, flooding, and structural failures killed miners across the American West by the thousands during this period. And it should come as no surprise that a culture living constantly with that kind of risk developed rich, elaborate folklore to make sense of the unexplainable. Tommyknockers, the mischievous or malevolent spirits said to haunt hard rock mines throughout Colorado, Nevada, and California, are the most famous example of this kind of belief, imported largely by Cornish miners who carried the tradition with them from tin mines back home, and stories like the Cripple Creek Drift fit comfortably into that same tradition of the underground, as a place where ordinary rules do not always apply. None of this means the story should be dismissed outright as pure invention with no basis in anything real, because the broader conditions that make it plausible are all genuinely documented. It is entirely true that Cripple Creek in 1893 was an underregulated, chaotic, fast-growing mining district where claims were staked, dug, and abandoned constantly, often with minimal record-keeping. It is entirely true that mine owners and investors in this exact period had strong financial incentives to suppress anything that threatened the district's reputation for safe, rational, profitable gold production. It is entirely true that labor unrest was already simmering in 1893, giving owners additional reason to control information tightly. It is entirely true that a catastrophic fire really did destroy much of the town's business district in 1896, genuinely eliminating an unknown quantity of period records. And it is entirely true that forge welding, while not the instant blue flame torch work most people picture today, was a real and available technology in 1893, capable of permanently sealing an iron mine collar if someone with the skill and the motivation decided it was worth the extra labor. What is not documented, and what likely never will be documented, given how much time has passed and how few written records from small, failed claims of this era survived at all, is whether anything unusual was actually found underground, and if so, what it actually was. The honest answer, the answer any serious historian of the district would give if pressed, is that we simply do not know, and that the absence of contemporary reporting is at least as consistent with the story being folklore that grew up around the district's genuinely secretive and chaotic labor practices as it is with the story being a suppressed truth. Legends like this one tend to survive precisely because they cannot be definitively disproven. There is no negative space large enough in the historical record to rule them out entirely, and that small, persistent gap of uncertainty is more than enough room for a story to live in for well over 100 years. What can be said with confidence is that the legend has outlasted almost everything else from that period of Cripple Creek's history that was not written down in a company ledger or a newspaper column. The strikes of 1893 and 1894 are well documented, studied by labor historians, and taught as important early chapters in the story of the Western Federation of Miners. The fires of 1896 are well documented, studied by local historians, and preserved in the archives of the region. The district's later boom years, its casinos, its long decline, and eventual tourist-driven revival are all thoroughly documented as well. But the story of the sealed drift survives almost entirely outside that documented record, passed from old miner to young miner, from grandparent to grandchild, kept alive not by evidence, but by the simple, durable appeal of a mystery that nobody has ever been able to fully close, in more ways than one. There is one more layer to this story worth walking through carefully, because it concerns the people who kept it alive long after the original crew, whoever they were, had either died, scattered, or simply stopped talking. Mining towns in the American West had a peculiar relationship with memory, because so much of the workforce was transient, drifting from camp to camp as strikes played out and new discoveries drew men elsewhere. The people who stayed behind, the shopkeepers, the boarding house owners, the bartenders, the wives and children of miners who put down roots even as their husbands and fathers moved from claim to claim, often became the real custodians of a town's oral history. It was not unusual for a story like this one to be kept alive, not by miners themselves, who had every reason to move on and forget, but by the people who ran the businesses that miners passed through, the ones who heard every rumor, every drunken confession, every half-remembered detail traded across a bar at the end of a long shift. If the story of the Cripple Creek Drift survived at all past its first telling, it likely survived this way, filtered through the memory of people who were listening rather than digging, and shaped over the decades by exactly the kind of embellishment that oral tradition always adds. By the 1930s and 1940s, when many of the district's original mines had already played out or been consolidated into larger operations, old-timers being interviewed for local history projects occasionally mentioned stories of this general shape without ever quite committing to specifics. A closed-off drift here, a claim abandoned under strange circumstances there, a mine owner who paid off his crew and left the district rather than face questions about what his men had seen underground. None of these fragments, taken individually, amount to proof of anything, but taken together, they suggest that the broad outline of a story like this one, whatever its true origin, had enough circulation in the district's collective memory that multiple unrelated tellers could reach for a version of it independently, which is itself an interesting piece of evidence about how deeply this kind of narrative had worked its way into the culture of the place, even if the specific details of anyone telling cannot be trusted. Modern interest in the story has followed a familiar arc, the same arc that seems to attach itself to almost every unexplained tale from the mining West. Amateur historians and hobbyist prospectors have, over the decades, gone looking for the physical remains of a sealed portal somewhere in the hills between Cripple Creek and Victor, usually without success, and usually without a clear enough description of the original claim to know where to even begin looking. The district's landscape has changed enormously since 1893. Large-scale open-pit operations that began reworking the area's ore bodies in the later 20th century have reshaped entire hillsides, burying, removing, or simply obliterating countless smaller 19th century workings in the process of chasing gold that the old hand-drilled shafts and drifts could never have reached. It is entirely possible that if a sealed portal like the one described in this story ever existed, it was destroyed decades ago by exactly the kind of industrial mining that made the district famous in the first place, erased without anyone involved ever knowing they had just paved over a piece of local legend. That uncertainty, more than any specific detail of the story itself, is probably the reason it has never quite died out. A legend with a fixed, findable, provable location tends to get resolved eventually, one way or another. Someone eventually goes and looks, and either the strange thing is there or it is not, and the story either gains new life or quietly falls apart. A legend whose central location may or may not still exist, buried under a century of erosion, vegetation, and industrial reworking, never gets that resolution. It exists permanently in the space between believable and disprovable, which is precisely the space where folklore thrives best. Every few years, someone posts about it. In a mining history forum, someone else mentions a relative who used to tell a version of it, and the story gets a little more mileage out of a mystery that was never going to be solved anyway, because the physical evidence for it, if it ever existed at all, was buried, sealed, or burned before anyone thought to write it down properly. Whether the sealed portal still sits somewhere in those hills today, buried under a century of scrub oak and aspen and the reworked earth of later mining operations, or whether it was destroyed decades ago by the very industry that supposedly tried to bury its secret, is a question that may never have a satisfying answer. Cripple Creek's hillsides are honeycombed with old workings, most of them long forgotten, most of them unmarked on any modern map. And it is entirely possible that whatever inspired this story, if anything did, is simply one more nameless hole in a landscape full of them, indistinguishable now from 100 other failed claims that were sealed for nothing stranger than the ordinary, unremarkable fact that the gold ran out. But every mining district has its stories, and every one of those stories persists, because somewhere, at some point, someone who was there swore it was true and told it to someone else who believed them enough to keep it alive. That, in the end, may be the only thing about this particular story that can be said for certain, not what was found in that drift in the fall of 1893, but the simple fact that whatever it was, real or imagined, was enough to make people want it forgotten, and enough to make other people determined to remember it anyway. Stand today on any of the overlooks above the modern Cripple Creek and Victor mining operation, and you can see just how much of that original 1890s landscape has been swallowed by later, larger ambitions. Terraces cut by modern machinery climb hillsides where hand-drilled shafts once dropped into darkness 1 foot at a time, powered by nothing more than a man with a single jackhammer and a candle. Somewhere beneath all of that reworked earth, or perhaps nowhere at all, is a stretch of tunnel that a handful of frightened miners walked away from more than 130 years ago, paid well enough to keep quiet and unable, in the end, to stay quiet forever. The gold that built this district is long since accounted for, weighed, smelted, and spent. The story that was supposedly buried alongside it never was. It survived the very silence it was bought with, passed down exactly the way the men who tried to bury it must have feared it would be, in whispers, around fires, from one generation of storytellers to the next until it reached us, still unresolved, still unproven, and still, after all this time, impossible to fully put to rest.